The dust had barely settled on the frozen Denver road when the stagecoach door violently slammed open, spilling a burst of mocking, liquor-laced laughter into the freezing autumn air. Gideon stepped forward, the heavy timber of his boots crunching against the frost-hardened earth. He extended a massive, calloused hand, expecting the sturdy, broad-shouldered pioneer woman the agency had sworn in writing would arrive. He needed a partner for the high ridges, someone who could haul water, chop kindling, and survive the brutal, unforgiving isolation of the timberline. Instead, a violently trembling boot, no larger than a child's, hovered hesitantly above the rusted iron step. The wind howled down the valley, violently whipping the heavy carriage door. From the dark interior of the coach, a woman emerged. She was devastatingly frail. Her slate blue traveling dress hung off her frame like clothes draped over a broken sparrow. The fabric was threadbare, slightly oversized, with a frayed hem and a collar buttoned suffocatingly high up her throat. She gripped that collar with white-knuckled desperation, her knuckles raw and cracked from the cold. The stagecoach driver, a greasy-haired man with a stained woolen coat, spat a dark stream of tobacco into the frost. He leaned down from his perch, grinning with a mouthful of rotting teeth. "There's your sturdy mountain bride, timberman," the driver sneered, wiping his mouth with the back of his dirty glove. "Compliments of the good folks back in Oakhaven. They took a collection. Said she was exactly what a brute like you deserved." Gideon felt the thick muscles in his jaw tighten, his storm-gray eyes narrowing, as he stared at the fragile, shattered woman shrinking into the shadows of the coach. This wasn't a clerical error. It was malice. The valley folk had used a human life as a punchline. But the truth of why they sent this ruined woman into the frozen peaks was far more complicated than anyone in that valley imagined. Stay with me until the end to hear it. Hit that like button and comment what city you're re-watching from right now. Mote want to see how far this story travels. If you have ever stood at the edge of a timberline when the first true freeze of the year rolls in, you know how utterly ruthless the world can feel. It is a cold that does not merely touch the skin, it seeks the bones. As Evelyn stepped down from the carriage, the mountain wind tore at her thin dress. Gideon instinctively moved. He did not say a word, but he shifted his towering, broad-shouldered frame to the left, standing directly between the biting crosswind and her trembling body. It was a subtle thing, a quiet wall of muscle and heavy canvas shielding her from the brunt of the storm. Evelyn noticed. For the briefest second, her large, haunted hazel eyes flicked upward, catching his. They were the eyes of a woman who had seen the end of the world and somehow survived it. There was a quiet, suffocating suffering in her gaze. Yet beneath the sorrow, Gideon recognized something else. Dignity. She was trembling so hard, her teeth were audibly chattering. And she clearly knew she was the butt of a vicious town joke. But she did not weep. She did not plead. She simply stood as tall as her shattered, underweight frame would allow, holding her high collar tight against her throat. "Go on. Grab your garbage." "Widow," the driver barked, kicking a single, battered leather valise out of the boot. The bag hit the icy dirt with a pathetic thud, tumbling over itself until it stopped at Gideon's boots. The latch was broken, tied together with a frayed piece of twine. Gideon did not yell at the driver. He did not draw the heavy iron revolver resting on his hip. A man who lives alone in the unforgiving high country learns that wasted energy is a fool's game. Instead, his jaw flexed. He reached up, slowly hooking his thick thumb under his scarred leather suspender strap, a quiet habit he fell into whenever a storm, natural or human, was brewing. He looked down at the tiny woman shivering in his shadow. She was terrified of him. He could see it in the rigid way she held her shoulders, the way she flinched when his shadow fell over her. To her, he must have looked like a mountain himself. 34 years of hard labor, thick dark blonde beard, scarred hands, and a massive chest wrapped in a weathered duster coat. "Is this all of it?" Gideon rumbled. His voice was incredibly deep. A low, resonant baritone that vibrated in the crisp air. Yet it lacked the harsh edge of the men she was used to. Evelyn swallowed hard, her throat working visibly. She gave a single, tight nod. Gideon slowly knelt. He did not snatch the bag from the dirt. He lifted the battered, pathetic valise, as if it were a chest of spun glass. With one massive hand, he gently brushed the frost and dirt from the worn leather. It was an unspoken, fleeting gesture of respect for the only possession she had in the world. He watched her from the corner of his eye. Evelyn's breath hitched. She was expecting a blow, a shout, a cruel rejection. She had been sent here to be discarded. She knew the letter the town sent had mocked her. She knew this giant of a man had asked for a worker, a pioneer, a woman vécépité, hot calluses and meat on her bones, not a walking ghost carrying the heavy stench of tragedy. Gideon stood, the small bag looking utterly ridiculous in his massive grip. His mind was a tempest of quiet fury. He had spent months preparing the cabin for a partner. He had chopped 3 cords of extra wood, secured extra provisions, and rebuilt the hearth. He lived in a brutal altitude, where the snow routinely buried the windows, where a weak heart or a fragile body meant a quick, unforgiving death. To bring this shivering, underweight widow up the pass was essentially a death sentence. The cruelty of the Oakhaven townspeople burned like a hot coal in his chest. They had not merely insulted him. They had thrown a wounded animal to the wolves just to hear it scream. He stared at Evelyn's hands. The skin was pale, almost translucent in the cold. She was pressing her palm against her left shoulder, gripping the thick fabric of her collar, as if trying to keep herself from falling apart entirely. "Well?" the driver sneered, wrapping the reins around his thick, gloved hands. "You seen the joke. You got your laugh. Hand her back over. Mort got orders to haul the baggage back to Oakhaven when you refuse her. Town council figured you'd take one look at that ruined waif and send her packing. Half fare for the return trip, though." Evelyn slowly closed her hazel eyes. The fight finally seemed to leave her delicate shoulders. The trembling worsened as she took a half step backward toward the stagecoach. She was preparing to climb back into the dark, freezing carriage, preparing to return to a town that hated her enough to ship her into the wilderness as a prank. Gideon looked at the driver. The man's greasy smile widened. Then, Gideon looked back at Evelyn. He saw the way she braced herself for the humiliation. He saw the way the world had chewed her up and spit her out, expecting her to just quietly disappear into the snow. The mountain man let out a slow, steady breath, the condensation pluming in the freezing air like smoke from a dragon's nostrils. Gideon stepped forward, placing his massive body squarely between Evelyn and the open door of the stagecoach. "Shut the door," Gideon muttered, his voice a low, terrifying rumble that carried over the howling wind. The driver's smile faltered. "What did you say? Timberman?" Mott said. "Shut your door and ride," Gideon commanded, his storm-gray eyes locking onto the man with the sudden, lethal intensity of a triggered trap. "She stays." Evelyn's head snapped up, her hazel eyes wide with pure, unadulterated shock. She stared at the broad back of the giant, standing between her and her past. He had every reason to send her back. He had every reason to be furious. She was weak, ruined, and useless to a man of the mountains. So why, as the driver swore and whipped the horses away into the dust, was the stoic giant picking up her pathetic luggage and gesturing for her to follow him up the treacherous, freezing trail? The wagon sat 50 yards up the trail, an imposing, heavily built flatbed hitched to a pair of massive, slate-gray draft horses. Gideon tossed her battered valise into the back, the leather hitting the thick pine floorboards with a hollow, lonely thud. Evelyn stood at the base of the wheel, staring up at the high wooden bench. It might as well have been a mountain itself. Her legs were trembling uncontrollably, the alpine chill biting through her thin skirt and stiffening her exhausted joints. She reached up, her raw, cracked fingers grasping the cold iron handhold. She pulled, but her delicate arms possessed no strength. Her scuffed boot slipped against the frost-slicked iron step before she could fall backward into the icy mud. A vast shadow fell over her. Gideon did not grab her. He simply stepped close behind her, close enough to catch her if she tumbled. An immovable wall of radiating heat and heavy canvas. "Take your time," Gideon rumbled, his deep voice steady, entirely devoid of the harsh impatience she expected. "There is no rush." She swallowed hard, her hand flying instinctively to grip the high, frayed collar of her dress. With a ragged breath, she found her footing and hauled her fragile frame onto the high wooden bench. Gideon climbed up the opposite side with terrifying grace for a man of his immense size. He took the heavy leather reins in his scarred, calloused hands, releasing the brake with a sharp clank. With a low whistle, the massive draft horses leaned into their harnesses, and the wagon lurched forward, beginning the agonizingly steep ascent into the high timberlines. There is a profound difference between the cruelty of men and the unforgiving nature of the mountains. A mountain does not hate you. The biting wind, the jagged rocks, the blinding snow, they are entirely indifferent. They test a person's marrow, but they do not harbor malice. Evelyn had spent the last year drowning in the malicious whispers, the cruel stares, and the intentional cruelty of her neighbors in Oakhaven. As the wagon climbed higher into the treacherous winding passes, the temperature plummeted. But for the first time in months, the air felt clean. The journey was a grueling, bone-rattling ordeal. The heavy oak wheels groaned against the jagged rocks, and thick white steam rose from the sweating flanks of the draft horses. The towering pines closed in around them, like silent sentinels, casting long, bruised purple shadows across the trail as the afternoon sun began to dip behind the peaks. Evelyn sat rigidly beside him, her small hands tightly woven together in her lap. She was freezing. Her thin lips had taken on a faint, terrifying shade of blue, and her entire frame shook violently with every gust of wind. Yet, she did not utter a single word of complaint. She did not whimper. She did not ask him to stop. She simply endured the misery with a quiet, unbreakable stoicism that caught Gideon completely off guard. He watched her from the corner of his eye. His thumb slowly rose, hooking casually beneath his scarred leather suspender strap as he studied her. The women he knew down in the valley would have been weeping by now, cursing the cold, demanding comfort. This fragile, broken bird of a woman simply tucked her chin lower, bearing the brutal elements with a silent dignity that demanded his respect. Gideon pulled back on the reins, bringing the heavy wagon to a sudden halt. Evelyn flinched, her large hazel eyes darting toward him in sudden panic. Bracing herself for a reprimand, Gideon did not look at her. He secured the brake, turned around, and reached into the bed of the wagon. He retrieved a massive, incredibly thick, wolf pelt blanket. Without a word, he shook it out and draped it directly over Evelyn. He did not merely hand it to her. He carefully settled the heavy, luxurious fur around her trembling shoulders, ensuring it completely enveloped her freezing body. The sheer weight of the pelt was grounding. The residual warmth of the sun baked into the fur instantly began to thaw her shivering bones. "Wrap it tight," Gideon muttered, his gaze fixed stubbornly on the horse's ears. Evelyn pulled the thick fur around herself, her raw fingers sinking into the softness. A tiny, bewildered breath escaped her lips. "Thank you," she whispered, the wind nearly stealing her fragile voice. Gideon merely grunted, clicking his tongue to set the horses in motion again. An hour later, the trail narrowed drastically. The frozen mud gave way to a spine-jarring gauntlet of deep ruts, exposed roots, and jagged stones. Gideon's massive arms flexed beneath his heavy wool Henley. He deliberately tightened his grip on the reins, steering the enormous draft horses onto a significantly more difficult, elevated lip of the trail. The wagon tilted precariously, forcing Gideon to brace his entire body weight against the footboard to keep them steady. Evelyn watched him in quiet awe. It took her a few moments to realize what he was doing. The path he had chosen required immense physical strength to navigate, but it kept the heavy wagon wheels completely out of the violent, jarring ruts. He was intentionally straining his own muscles, fighting the immense weight of the horses and the wagon, entirely to spare her fragile body the brutal impact of the broken road. It was an unspoken, monumental act of care. No one had shielded her from pain in over a year. No one had cared if she bruised or broke. She stared at his rugged, weathered profile, at the sharp line of his d'Ave cap beneath his thick, dark blonde beard. He was a terrifyingly large man, capable of immense destruction. Yet his hands commanded the reins with deliberate, protective precision. The silence stretching between them was no longer an empty, terrifying void. For Gideon, the silence of the mountains was his sanctuary, his peace. For Evelyn, silence had always been a weapon used against her, a sign of being ignored and discarded. But as the miles passed, the heavy, quiet space between them began to feel remarkably like safety. By the time the wagon finally crested the final ridge, the sky had bruised into a deep, star-speckled indigo. The air was brutally thin and cold enough to crack stone. Nestled against the sheer rock face of the mountain stood a surprisingly large, meticulously built log cabin. It was a fortress of thick, hand-hewn timber, its slate roof heavy with a fresh dusting of snow. A sturdy wrap-around porch overlooked the sprawling, dizzying drop of the valley below. It looked impenetrable. It looked completely cut off from the cruelty of the world. Gideon pulled the exhausted horses to a halt near the porch. He set the iron brake and easily vaulted down from the high bench, his heavy boots crunching against the frozen earth. He walked to the back, grabbed her valise with one hand, and stepped around to her side of the wagon. Evelyn tried to move, but the freezing journey had taken its toll. Her legs were numb, her joints completely locked. She weakly pushed the heavy pelt aside, dragging herself toward the edge of the bench. But her limbs refused to support her. Gideon stepped close to the wheel, looking up at Motfeher in the moonlight. He could see the absolute exhaustion carving deep shadows beneath her hazel eyes. "Let me," he breathed, his tone softer than the howling wind. He reached up, his massive, calloused hands bypassing her arms entirely to grasp her firmly by the waist. His touch was incredibly careful, mindful of his own overwhelming strength, as he effortlessly lifted her from the high wooden bench. For a fraction of a second, as she descended through the cold air, her hands instinctively rested against his broad, solid shoulders. But as her boots touched the frozen dirt, Gideon's large hand naturally shifted, his thick fingers lightly wrapping around her upper back and left shoulder to steady her footing. The moment his fingers pressed against the fabric of her high-collared dress, Evelyn let out a sharp, breathless gasp of absolute, unadulterated agony. Her entire body violently recoiled, violently flinching away from his touch, as if he had pressed a white-hot branding iron against her flesh. She stumbled backward, nearly falling into the snow, her right hand flying up to desperately clutch her left shoulder. Her hazel eyes were wide, blown out with sudden, blinding panic as she stared up at Motf the giant before her, her chest heaving as she guarded the heavy fabric of her coat. Gideon froze, his large hands hovering empty in the cold air, his storm-gray eyes locking onto her terrified face. He hadn't gripped her hard. He had barely applied an ounce of pressure. What in God's name was she hiding beneath that heavy, suffocating collar? Gideon immediately stepped back. He lowered his large hands, retreating entirely out of her personal space, leaving a vast gulf of freezing mountain air between them. He did not ask her what was wrong. He did not demand to see beneath the thick, suffocating fabric of her frayed collar. He simply stood motionless in the moonlight, a towering silhouette of restraint, allowing her trembling frame the space to breathe. Evelyn kept her hand clamped desperately over her left shoulder. Her chest heaved. She waited for the inevitable interrogation, the frustrated sigh, the cruel demand to know what broken, defective goods he had been saddled with, and, instead, Gideon simply turned toward the heavy oak door of the cabin. He lifted the iron latch. The hinges swung silently, revealing a cavernous, pitch-black interior. He stepped inside, striking a single sulfur match against the stone frame. Golden light blossomed outward. The interior of the cabin was remarkably beautiful, built with an astonishing level of craftsmanship. The walls were tightly fitted, hand-hewn logs chinked to perfection. A massive hearth made of smooth gray river stones dominated the far wall. The air held the deep, comforting scent of dried sage, seasoned pine, and old leather. Every piece of furniture, the thick dining table, the heavy chairs, the broad shelving, was oversized, built specifically to accommodate a man of his immense proportions. Standing in the doorway, Evelyn felt impossibly small, a fragile ghost lingering on the threshold of a giant sanctuary. Gideon knelt before the hearth, feeding a cluster of dry kindling into the ashes. The flames roared to life with a comforting crackle, casting, dancing, warm shadows across the polished wooden floor. He stood, dusting his massive hands against his heavy canvas trousers. He walked to the thick wooden chair, positioned closest to the radiating heat of the fire. Without looking at her, he pulled the chair out, angling it precisely so the warmth would wrap around whoever sat in it. "Close the door against the wind," Gideon murmured, his deep voice carrying a quiet finality. It was an invitation, not a command. Evelyn stepped inside, leaning her meager weight against the heavy timber door until the iron latch clicked into place. The sudden absence of the howling wind felt miraculous. The heavy, protective silence of the cabin enveloped her, entirely different from the oppressive, judgmental silence of the town she had left behind. She moved to the chair by the fire, sinking into the sturdy wood. Her bones ached with a profound, terrifying weariness. But as the heat slowly penetrated her threadbare dress, she felt a microscopic fraction of her defensive tension begin to melt away. Gideon did not linger. He retrieved a spare, thick wool blanket from a chest, placed it gently at the foot of her chair, and retreated to the opposite side of the cabin to tend to his heavy gear. He gave her the one thing she desperately needed: absolute, unbothered peace. By sunrise, the mountain had transformed into a blinding expanse of white frost and crystalline light. Evelyn awoke before the dawn broke over the peaks. Her body screamed in protest, every joint stiffened by the grueling journey and the deeply embedded chill of the high altitude. But she refused to stay in bed. She was a charity case, a cruel joke sent to a man who needed a capable worker. If she proved utterly useless, he would inevitably march her right back down that mountain and hand her over to the cruelty of Oakhaven. She dressed quickly in the biting dawn air, buttoning her high collar all the way to her chin, her stiff, raw fingers fumbling with the tiny clasps. When Gideon returned from checking the horses, he found the fragile widow waging a silent, desperate war in his kitchen. Evelyn was attempting to prepare the morning meal. The cast-iron stove was a monstrous, heavy thing, requiring significant muscle to operate. She had managed to light the firebox, but the massive iron kettle resting on the counter was clearly too heavy for her delicate frame. Gideon paused in the doorway, wiping the snow from his boots. He watched her. She gripped the thick iron handle, they kept to hot both hands, her knuckles turning bone white. She planted her scuffed boots against the floorboards, biting her pale lower lip in absolute concentration. She heaved. The heavy iron kettle barely scraped an inch across the thick wooden counter. She stopped, her breathing ragged, a thin sheen of sweat breaking out on her pale forehead. She did not cry. She did not throw her hands up in defeat. Instead, she adjusted her grip, wrapped a thin cloth around the handle to protect her blistered palms, and closed her hazel eyes in silent prayer. She poured every ounce of her limited, fragile strength into her back and shoulders, straining against the immense weight of the iron. Her arms trembled violently. The kettle lifted a mere fraction of an inch, swinging precariously toward the glowing stovetop. Her foot slipped. The kettle plunged downward. Before the heavy iron could smash into the wooden floorboards. A massive, scarred hand easily caught the handle directly beneath hers. Evelyn gasped, her heart leaping into her throat. Gideon stood right beside her, an immovable mountain of strength. He hooked his free thumb under his leather suspender strap, his storm-gray eyes completely calm. He did not snatch the kettle away, nor did he scold her for struggling. He merely bore the agonizing weight of the iron in his one hand, allowing her hands to remain on the handle, letting her guide it together with him onto the stovetop. "The iron holds the cold," Gideon rumbled. His voice, a low, steady vibration, "makes it heavier than it looks." He was giving her an excuse. He was preserving her dignity. Evelyn released the handle, her arms shaking so badly she had to hide them in the folds of her skirt. She looked up at his rugged, weathered profile, completely stunned by the profound lack of judgment in his tone. "Mott can do it," Evelyn whispered, her voice fragile but laced with a desperate, quiet pride. "Moat just need a little time. Mort promise you. Moat am not entirely useless." Gideon looked down at her. He saw the sheer exhaustion haunting her eyes, the terrifying thinness of her wrists, and the undeniable fire of pure, unadulterated perseverance burning fiercely in her chest. "Mott never said you were," Gideon muttered. He stepped away, moving toward the far wall. When he returned, he carried a smaller, significantly lighter copper pot. He placed it gently on the counter, beside the heavy iron kettle. It was an unspoken concession, a quiet acknowledgement of her willingness to work, paired with a subtle adjustment to make that work survivable. The morning passed in a quiet, harmonious rhythm. Evelyn swept the heavy floors, refusing to stop until every trace of dirt was gone. Gideon watched her from the porch as he sharpened his tools, profoundly moved by her silent tenacity. She was broken, undeniably damaged by whatever horror she had survived, but her spirit was wrought from pure iron. Later, that afternoon, Gideon knelt near the heavy wash basin in the corner of the cabin. He had noticed a slight dip in the thick floorboards under the weight of the water barrel and intended to shore it up before the true winter freeze warped the wood entirely. He wedged a heavy iron pry bar beneath the loose plank, applying his immense strength to lift the timber. The wood groaned, popping free from the ancient iron nails. As the board lifted, something small and metallic tumbled out from the narrow gap between the planks, hitting the dirt subfloor with a faint, hollow clink. It must have slipped from Evelyn's pocket or fallen from her trembling hands while she was fetching water. Gideon set the heavy board aside. He reached down into the dust. His thick fingers brushed against the object. He picked it up. He's holding it up to the slanting afternoon light, filtering through the window pane. It was a small, brass locket, but it was utterly destroyed. The metal was heavily charred, warped and partially melted by exposure to an intense, terrifying heat. The delicate chain was completely gone, reduced to a melted nub at the top of the clasp. The front of the locket was fused shut, blackened by soot that had been scrubbed at mouth repeatedly, but never entirely washed away. Gideon's jaw tightened. He rubbed his thumb over the warped metal, brushing away a layer of fine ash. He flipped the charred locket over. The back of the brass casing had miraculously survived the worst of the flames. There, etched deeply into the tarnished metal, was a jagged, uneven inscription. Gideon narrowed his eyes, reading the deeply unsettling words carved into the burnt brass. "If Mott burn, you must carry the flame." Gideon stared at the horrifyingly morbid inscription, the heavy weight of the locket suddenly feeling like a lead anchor in his palm. He looked toward the cabin door, where the delicate, trembling widow was quietly folding laundry on the porch, her neck hidden tightly beneath that high, suffocating collar. What exact kind of inferno had this fragile woman crawled out of? The sky did not merely darken. It bruised into a violent, suffocating slate gray, swallowing the high peaks in an instant. The first true blizzard of the season did not arrive, with a gentle warning of flurries. It hit the timberline like a physical blow, a sheer wall of screaming white wind that rattled the thick hand-hewn logs of the cabin to their very foundations. Gideon slipped the deeply charred locket deep into the heavy canvas pocket of his trousers. The mystery of the burnt brass and its morbid inscription would have to wait. The mountain was demanding his immediate, undivided attention. He moved with the calculated, heavy grace of a man who understood the lethal nature of the altitude. He slammed the thick oak shutters closed over the glass panes, dropping the heavy iron bars into place with a series of solid, echoing thuds. In a matter of minutes, the cabin was completely sealed against the wrath of the plummeting temperatures, transformed into an impenetrable wooden fortress against the howling void outside. Evelyn stood near the center of the room, her small hands instinctively rising to grip her high, frayed collar. She watched the massive timbermen secure their survival. The sheer, concussive force of the wind battering the roof was terrifying, a relentless, shrieking roar that promised absolute freezing death to anything caught beyond the thick timber walls. Yet, as Gideon methodically fed massive, split logs into the roaring riverstone hearth, a profound and entirely unfamiliar sensation began to settle over her fragile shoulders. She was safe. For the past year, storms had meant terror. In Oakhaven, the drafts had bitten through the rotting walls of her rented room, and the cold had settled deep into her hollow bones, a constant reminder of her absolute vulnerability. But here, standing in the golden, radiating warmth of the massive hearth, the blizzard outside felt utterly powerless. Gideon turned from the fire, brushing the bark dust from his calloused palms. He noticed her shivering, her scuffed, thin leather boots soaked through from her earlier attempts to fetch firewood from the porch. He did not point out her wet footwear. He did not lecture her on the dangers of frostbite in the high country. Instead, he walked to a heavy cedar chest beneath the window, retrieving a pair of incredibly thick, hand-knit woolen socks. He carried them to the hearth, draping them deliberately over the smooth, heated river stones for a long minute, until the thick wool absorbed the fire's radiating warmth. Then, he crossed the room, stopping a respectful distance from her. He extended his massive, scarred hand, offering the steaming, heated wool. "Trade your boots," Gideon rumbled, his deep voice effortlessly cutting through the dull roar of the wind outside. Evelyn looked at the thick socks, then up at his storm-gray eyes. A quiet, trembling breath parted her lips. She took the wool, her cold fingers grazing the absolute heat trapped in the fabric. The simple, unprompted act of providing warmth shattered another thin layer of the icy defense she had built around her heart. She retreated to the oversized chair by the fire, shedding her ruined boots and pulling the heavy, heated wool over her freezing feet. An involuntary sigh of pure, physical relief slipped from her lips. Gideon heard it. He hooked his thick thumb under his leather suspender strap. A faint, almost imperceptible softening touching the rugged corners of his eyes. The afternoon bled into evening, entirely swallowed by the relentless darkness of the storm. The forced proximity of the cabin could have been suffocating, but it instead fostered a deeply companionable, shared silence. The space between them ceased to be a void of strangers and slowly transformed into a quiet arena of mutual, unspoken care. Gideon moved to the heavy cast iron stove, taking over the cooking duties without a word of discussion. He understood instinctively that her fragile body needed sustenance far more than it needed to prove its worth. He prepared a thick, nutrient-dense venison stew, letting it simmer until the rich, savory aroma filled every corner of the room. He filled a heavy ceramic bowl, bringing it to her chair by the fire. He set it gently on the small table beside her, alongside a thick slice of buttered, warm bread. "Eat," he murmured, retreating to the opposite side of the hearth with his own portion. Evelyn wrapped her raw, pale hands around the heated ceramic. The warmth seeped into her stiff joints. She ate slowly, savoring the rich, life-giving heat of the broth. She watched Gideon from beneath her dark eyelashes. He sat cross-legged on the floorboards, a towering giant bathed in the orange glow of the embers, entirely at peace in the heart of a lethal blizzard. He finished his meal and retrieved a broken leather harness trace and an awl, beginning to repair the thick leather with precise, powerful motions. Evelyn leaned her head back against the thick wood of the chair. The wind shrieked against the shutters, but the golden firelight danced across the floorboards. She watched his massive hands work the leather. There was an undeniable, quiet beauty in his immense strength, specifically because he kept it so profoundly restrained. He was a man capable of breaking a horse or felling a massive pine. Yet he handled the smallest tasks with a deeply respectful gentleness. For the first time since the devastating fire that had taken her home and shattered her life, Evelyn felt the crushing weight of her grief loosen its suffocating grip on her chest. She was a ruined, severely scarred woman discarded by a cruel world. But in this isolated cabin, under the quiet, watchful protection of this stoic mountain man, she felt entirely, remarkably human. Night eventually claimed the cabin. The embers in the hearth burned down to a deep, pulsing, cherry-red glow. Gideon had insisted she take the thick feather bed in the alcove, while he took a heavy bedroll on the floorboards directly across the door, positioning himself as a literal barrier between her and the outside world. The silence of the cabin was absolute, save for the rhythmic, dull thud of the wind against the logs. Deep in the dead of the freezing night, the tranquility violently shattered. It began as a low, whimpering gasp from the alcove, a desperate pulling of breath. Then, a scream tore through the dark. It was a sound of pure, unadulterated torment, raw and echoing with absolute terror. Gideon was on his feet before his eyes were fully open, his heavy boots hitting the floorboards, his hand instinctively dropping to the heavy iron revolver resting on the table. He scanned the dark cabin, his heart hammering violently against his ribs. The heavy iron bars on the door and windows were untouched. The threat was not outside. Another ragged, agonizing shriek ripped from the alcove. Gideon rushed forward, abandoning his weapon, his massive frame filling the narrow entryway. Evelyn was thrashing violently in the center of the bed. The heavy quilts were kicked entirely off her fragile body. Her eyes were squeezed tightly shut, tears streaming down her pale, sweat-slicked cheeks. She was trapped in the suffocating depths of a horrific night terror, fighting an invisible, terrifying enemy. Her hands flew to her throat, her cracked fingers desperately clawing at the high, frayed collar of her dress, trying to tear the fabric away from her skin as if it were melting into her flesh. "Let it burn," Evelyn shrieked, her voice cracking, breaking into a sobbing, desperate plea to the empty shadows. "Please, God, let it burn. Don't touch it. Let it burn." Gideon lunged forward, his massive hands reaching out to grab her trembling shoulders, desperate to shake her awake, to pull her out of the nightmare. But as his fingers hovered mere inches from the thick fabric of her collar, he abruptly froze. The memory of her absolute, breathless agony when he had lightly touched her shoulder by the wagon slammed into his mind. He remembered the violent flinch, the pure panic in her hazel eyes. He stared down at her thrashing, desperately fragile frame, his massive hands paralyzed in the darkness. He possessed enough physical strength to hold down a panicked draft horse, yet he was entirely powerless to comfort this shattered woman without hurting her. Evelyn sobbed uncontrollably in her sleep, her fingers digging deeper into the frayed collar, curling into tight, agonizing fists against her own throat. What horrific, consuming inferno was this fragile woman, desperately trying to escape behind those tightly shut eyes? Gideon lowered his massive hands, pulling them away from her thrashing frame, before his heavy fingers could make contact with the mysterious, agonizing trauma buried beneath her high collar. He could not touch her. He could not shake her awake. Instead, he planted his heavy palms flat against the thick timber bed frame, leaning his broad chest closer to the mattress. "Evelyn," Gideon rumbled, pitching his exceptionally deep baritone to a low, commanding vibration that resonated through the very floorboards. "Evelyn, open your eyes." She gasped, her fingers still clawing desperately at her own throat. "You are in the mountains," Gideon commanded softly, his voice a steady, unbreakable anchor cutting through the violent tempest of her terror. "The fire is dead. You are safe. Open your eyes." Her spine arched, a final, ragged sob tearing from her lips before her large hazel eyes snapped open. The absolute darkness of the cabin greeted her, illuminated only by the faint, pulsing cherry-red glow of the dying hearth. Her chest heaved violently. She lay frozen, staring up at the towering, shadowed silhouette of the giant leaning over her bed. For a terrifying second, she did not know where she was. The suffocating stench of smoke and burning timber from her nightmare still clung to the back of her throat. Then, she felt the crisp, desperately clean mountain air slipping through the heavy logs. She saw the familiar, rugged outline of Gideon's broad shoulders. Evelyn immediately curled inward, pulling her knees to her chest, her right hand flying up to desperately secure the frayed edges of her collar. She squeezed her eyes shut, utterly humiliated. She had broken the absolute rule of her survival. She had let the screaming madness escape the prison of her own mind. In Oakhaven, her night terrors had earned her nothing but vicious mockery and furious demands to keep her unnatural wailing quiet. She waited for his anger. She waited for him to curse her for waking him. Gideon pushed off the bedframe, silently retreating into the shadows. He did not ask her what she saw in the dark. He did not demand an explanation for the horrific words she had screamed. A moment later, a heavy ceramic cup entered her peripheral vision, held out by a massive, scarred hand. Evelyn slowly uncurled, blinking through her residual tears. Gideon stood a respectful distance away, his storm-gray eyes profoundly calm. Steam curled delicately from the rim of the cup. He had kept a kettle warm on the edge of the stove overnight. She reached out with trembling, pale fingers, taking the heated ceramic. It was steeped with a fragrant, earthy mint that immediately cut through the phantom smell of smoke trapped in her nose. She drank, the hot liquid soothing her raw, screaming throat. It was an incredibly simple, unspoken gesture of pure comfort that settled deep into her hollow chest. "The storm is breaking," Gideon murmured, turning his broad back to give her privacy as he walked toward the hearth to stoke the embers. "Try to rest." By dawn, the howling wind had completely died, leaving behind a profound, ringing silence. The world outside, the heavy oak shutters, was buried beneath 3 feet of pristine, blindingly white powder. Evelyn woke to the smell of fresh coffee and the rhythmic, distant thud of an axe ringing through the crystalline air. Gideon was already outside, clearing the pathways. She dressed quickly, determined to make up for the disruption she had caused in the night. She wrapped a thick shawl over her high-collared dress, bracing herself for the grueling physical labor of the morning chores. Her blistered palms throbbed at the mere memory of the massive iron water buckets and the impossibly heavy cast-iron skillet. Evelyn stepped onto the frozen porch, pulling the crisp, freezing air deep into her lungs. She walked toward the water barrels, lined up against the cabin wall, steeling her fragile nerves to drag the heavy iron pails toward the frozen creek. But as she approached the station, she stopped entirely dead in her tracks. The monstrous, rusted iron buckets were gone. In their place sat 2 brand new, incredibly lightweight, tightly coopered cedar buckets. Evelyn stared at them, her breath pluming in the freezing air. She reached down, lifting one by the handle. The wood was fresh, radiating the sharp, vivid scent of freshly planed pine and sweet resin. But it was the handle that made her throat tighten. The unforgiving wire bale had been meticulously wrapped in a thick layer of incredibly soft, pliable deer hide, secured tightly with tiny, precise leather stitches. She turned her stunned gaze toward the woodpile. The massive, dangerous splitting maul Gideon used was resting against the chopping block. But right beside it, neatly stacked in a pristine, chest-high pile, was a massive mountain of kindling. The wood had been chopped impossibly fine, split down into delicate, finger-thin slivers that required absolutely zero axe work to feed into the stove. She walked back into the kitchen, in a complete daze. The agonizingly heavy cast iron skillet had been moved to the highest shelf, completely out of reach. In its designated spot on the stovetop rested the lightweight copper pan. Evelyn gripped the soft leather handle of the new cedar bucket, her knuckles slowly losing their terrified, bone-white tension. A deeply profound emotional realization washed over her fragile frame. In the valley, whenever she faltered beneath the crushing weight of her widowhood, the townspeople handed her heavier burdens. They punished her weakness, mocking her inability to carry the horrific debts and physical labor her late husband had left behind. They had demanded she harden herself, and when she broke, they shipped her away as a joke. But this towering, stoic giant of a man operated on an entirely different moral axis. Gideon had silently observed her struggles. He had noted her blistering palms, her trembling arms, and her quiet, desperate perseverance. Instead of demanding she become stronger, he had simply altered the world around her so she could survive it without breaking. He was building an invisible, protective scaffolding around her shattered dignity. She carried the cedar buckets to the creek, the soft leather resting gently against her raw palms. It was not easy work, but for the first time in a year, it was not impossible. When she returned to the porch, Gideon was standing near the heavy draft horses, brushing the thick winter coat of the massive gray mare. He paused, his massive hands resting gently on the horse flank. Evelyn stopped at the top of the stairs, a full cedar bucket in each hand. She looked across the snow-blinded yard, her hazel eyes locking onto his storm-gray gaze. She did not verbally thank him for the buckets, the kindling, or the copper pan. Words felt entirely too small for the sheer magnitude of his unspoken kindness. Instead, she simply stood a little taller, relaxing the rigid, terrified posture of her shoulders. Gideon watched her. His thumb slowly rose, hooking casually beneath his scarred leather suspender strap. The tense, rigid set of his jaw softened a fraction of an inch. He gave a single, almost imperceptible nod of approval, a quiet acknowledgement of her victory, before turning back to the horses. For the first time since the fire, a tiny, fragile seed of genuine trust began to take root in Evelyn's battered heart. The peaceful, nudes, insulated rhythm of their morning was violently shattered by a shrill, echoing whistle from the valley trail. Gideon's head snapped up, his body instantly tensing into a wall of solid muscle. He stepped away from the horses, his eyes tracking a dark shape moving agonizingly slow up the treacherous, snow-choked pass. It was a lone rider, bundled in heavy furs, leading a pack mule carrying thick canvas sacks. "Courier," Gideon muttered, his deep voice carrying a sudden, rigid edge. Evelyn's heart plummeted into her stomach, a cold wave of dread instantly washing away the morning's warmth. The valley was invading. The courier rode into the yard, his horse blowing heavy clouds of steam. He was a young, sharp-eyed man with a permanent, mocking smirk etched into his frostbitten face. He did not dismount, clearly eager to flee the brutal altitude as quickly as possible. "Pass is barely clear, timberman," the courier shouted over the wind, tossing 2 heavy canvas sacks of coffee and flour directly into the snow at Gideon's boots. "Brought your winter staples." And Mott got something else. The courier reached into his heavy wool coat, retrieving a folded, wax-sealed piece of heavy parchment. He looked past Gideon's massive frame, his eyes locking onto the fragile, slender woman standing frozen on the porch. The courier's smirk widened into something deeply ugly and intentionally cruel. "Letter from the town council down in Oakhaven," the courier sneered, tossing the parchment into the air. It fluttered down, landing perfectly on top of the flour sack. "Figured you'd be wanting the warranty details on that ruined joke they shipped up here." counsel said. To tell you there is no refunds on damaged goods. The courier laughed. A harsh, scraping sound. Before violently wheeling his horse around and spurring it back down the mountain trail, Evelyn dropped the cedar buckets. The water spilled across the frozen planks, but she did not feel the freezing spray against her ankles. Her hazel eyes were locked entirely onto the heavy parchment resting in the snow. She recognized the dark, aggressive handwriting scrawled across the front. It belonged to the cruelest man in the valley, the man who had orchestrated her humiliating exile. Gideon did not look at her. He stared down at the wax-sealed letter in the snow. His thick jaw locking ve capite hot, such force a muscle twitched visibly beneath his dark blonde beard. He slowly bent down, his massive, scarred hand closing over the parchment. He stood, his storm-gray eyes darkening into the color of a lethal, violent thunderhead. What malicious, devastating words had the town written to the giant about his ruined bride? The brittle, sewed, freezing air seemed to shatter into jagged shards as Gideon broke the thick, crimson wax seal. The sharp crack echoed across the snow-blinded yard, a violently loud sound in the profound silence left behind by the courier's departure. Evelyn remained frozen on the porch, her raw fingers completely abandoning the cedar buckets to fly upward, desperately clutching the frayed, high collar of her dress. Her chest hitched in short, terrified gasps. She watched the giant unfold the heavy parchment, every muscle in his massive back tensing into thick cords of solid iron beneath his heavy wool coat. Gideon read the dark, aggressive scrawl in absolute silence. The letter was a masterpiece of human malice. It was penned by Oakhaven's councilmen, men who hid their cruelty behind polite smiles and church pews. The ink detailed the full, hideous scope of the joke they had played on the timberman. They mocked his request for a strong, capable pioneer bride. Instead, they gleefully explained they had shipped him the town's absolute refuse, a destitute, fragile widow drowning in her late husband's debts. The letter casually and viciously referenced her physical ruin, sneering about the hideous, grotesque scars she hid beneath her clothes, laughing at the prospect of Gideon, recoiling in absolute disgust the moment he saw what he had legally bound himself to. They suggested he work her until she broke, or simply let the mountain freeze her out, absolving them of the guilt of watching her starve in their pristine streets. Gideon's jaw locked with a force that threatened to shatter his own teeth. He did not possess the vocabulary for elegant poetic outrage. He was a man of timber and stone, a solitary creature who understood the honest brutality of a wolf pack or a rock slide. But this calculated, cowardly destruction of a profoundly suffering woman for pure sport ignited a dark, towering fury deep within his chest. Its iron, violent loyalty not born of romance, but of a fundamental, absolute respect for human dignity. He slowly lowered the heavy parchment. His storm-gray eyes, usually so calm and utterly unreadable, were completely black with a lethal, brooding rage. Evelyn watched his face transform. A sickening, icy wave of sheer panic washed over her fragile frame. He knows. The terrifying thought spiraled wildly through her mind, seizing her lungs. He knows about the scars. He knows how hideous Moat am beneath this heavy wool. He knows Moat am ruined, defective, a monster dressed up as a woman. Gideon slowly folded the letter. He stepped toward the porch, his heavy boots crunching menacingly through the pristine snow. He bypassed the spilled water entirely, stepping up onto the thick wooden planks. Evelyn violently flinched backward, her shoulder slamming against the heavy timber wall of the cabin. She squeezed her hazel eyes shut, bracing for the inevitable explosion of rage. She waited for him to curse her, to demand she strip away the collar so he could see the grotesque joke for himself, to order her to pack her battered valise and march straight back into the freezing wilderness. Instead, a massive, warm hand easily scooped up the 2 overturned cedar buckets from the floorboards. "Go inside," Gideon commanded. his exceptionally deep voice dropping to a terrifyingly low, vibrating rumble. It was not a request. Evelyn stumbled through the doorway, her legs trembling so violently, she nearly collapsed against the kitchen counter. Gideon followed her inside. He did not look at her. He walked purposefully across the room, carrying the heavy parchment in his massive fist. He stopped directly in front of the roaring river stone hearth. Without a moment of hesitation, without uttering a single word of inquiry about her past, he tossed the maliciously penned letter directly into the heart of the flames. The fire eagerly consumed the paper. The thick wax seal melted into the embers with a sharp hiss, sending a faint, acrid plume of black smoke up the chimney. Gideon stood over the hearth, watching the cruelty burn down to gray ash. He hooked his thick thumb aggressively beneath his scarred leather suspender strap, his broad back radiating a fierce, untouchable hostility. Evelyn stood trembling near the heavy iron stove, completely misinterpreting the terrifying silence. In her traumatized mind, his silence was not protective. It was the suffocating silence of absolute disgust. She watched the way he stared into the flames, his posture rigid and unapproachable. He could not even bear to look at her. The town had exposed her, and now this giant, who had treated her with such unearned, gentle kindness, knew exactly how broken she truly was. The afternoon stretched into an agonizingly tense, oppressive evening. Gideon moved through the cabin like a caged, dangerous animal. His mind was entirely consumed by a fierce, protective wrath toward the valley below. He silently vowed that if those councilmen ever set foot on his mountain, they would not walk back down. But Evelyn only saw the anger. He prepared their evening meal in total silence. He ladled a generous portion of heavy stew into her ceramic bowl and placed it gently on the small table beside her chair. He even purposefully shifted the table an inch closer to the fire so she wouldn't have to reach into the cold air to eat. It was a quiet, habitual warmth beat, an instinctual need to provide for her. Yet, when she quietly murmured her thanks, he merely grunted, turning his dark, stormy gaze away and retreating to the far corner of the cabin. The rejection sliced cleanly through her fragile heart. The tiny, delicate seed of trust that had begun to take root that morning withered and died instantly. The invisible scaffolding he had built to protect her dignity felt entirely shattered. As the deep, freezing night settled over the peaks, Gideon took his place by the hearth. He retrieved a heavy steel whetstone and his massive splitting axe. The rhythmic, scraping hiss of the stone against the heavy iron blade echoed through the silent cabin, a sharp, aggressive sound that grated against Evelyn's completely frayed nerves. She lay perfectly still beneath the heavy quilts in the alcove, her hands gripping her high collar until her knuckles ached. She could not stay here. The realization bloomed in her chest with a cold, terrifying certainty. If he was disgusted by her now, merely from reading the town's cruel words, how would he react when he eventually saw the true extent of the horrific burns across her back and shoulder? He would despise her. The kindness would curdle into resentment. He would throw her out, hauling her back to Oakhaven in humiliation, surrendering her to the very men who had written that letter. She would absolutely not allow them to parade her through the streets a second time. She would not endure their mocking laughter again. The rhythmic scraping of the whetstone finally ceased. Evelyn waited, scarcely daring to breathe, as Gideon moved about the cabin. She heard the heavy clunk of the iron bar dropping into place across the door. She heard the rustle of his heavy canvas coat being hung on the peg, and the deep, heavy sigh of his massive frame settling onto the bedroll near the threshold. An hour passed. The only sound in the cabin was the low, steady crackle of the dying embers and the deep, rhythmic breathing of the mountain man lost in sleep. Evelyn threw back the heavy quilts. She moved with absolute, terrified silence. She did not reach for the wonderfully thick, heated woolen socks he had given her. She felt entirely unworthy of them now. Instead, she slipped her freezing feet into her own scuffed, ruined leather boots. She wrapped her threadbare shawl tightly around her frail shoulders, buttoning her high collar all the way up to her chin. She grabbed her battered valise from the corner, her blistered hands trembling violently. She crept toward the heavy oak door. Gideon lay entirely still on his bedroll, his broad back facing the room. Evelyn swallowed a terrified sob, stepping carefully over his massive legs. She reached out, her pale, shaking fingers wrapping around the thick iron bar, securing the door. The metal was freezing to the touch. She knew the absolute lethality of the mountain night. Without the heavy draft horses or the wagon, stepping out into the brutal, sub-zero wilderness in her threadbare dress was almost certainly a death sentence. But as she gripped the iron latch, the fear of his impending disgust, the terror of his quiet, brooding rejection, felt infinitely worse than the freezing wind outside. She slowly, agonizingly lifted the iron bar, the thick metal groaning softly in the quiet darkness. If she slipped out now, she could disappear into the snow before he ever had to look upon her scarred, ruined body again. The heavy iron bar groaned softly against the thick oak timber. Evelyn pushed the thick metal upward, her freezing fingers slipping against the frost-coated iron. A tiny, microscopic sliver of the outside night broke the cabin's perfect seal, and an absolutely brutal gust of sub-zero wind hissed viciously through the crack. The icy draft struck her delicate collarbone like a physical blow. Instantly, the damaged, ruined flesh hidden beneath her high collar fiercely seized. Thus, sudden, biting cold violently contracted the tight, puckered skin across her left shoulder, sending a blinding, nauseating spike of absolute agony straight down her spine. Evelyn bit her pale lower lip hard enough to taste copper, stifling a desperate, agonizing gasp. She leaned her forehead against the freezing timber of the door, her entire frail body trembling uncontrollably. She could not do it. Walking out into the unforgiving, blindingly white mountain night, with unbandaged, weeping scars, was not an escape. It was a slow, agonizing suicide. The brutal journey up the mountain and the sheer terror of the evening had severely aggravated the damaged tissue. If she was to survive the trek down to the valley, she desperately needed to properly cleanse the inflamed skin and bind it tightly with clean linen. She needed her armor perfectly in place before she faced the wilderness. As she slowly, silently lowered the heavy iron bar back into its cradle, turning away from the heavy oak door, she crept toward the wash station, tucked into the far corner of the cabin. Gideon lay entirely motionless on his heavy bedroll near the threshold, his massive chest rising and falling in a slow, deep, rhythmic cadence. Even in sleep, he had angled his incredibly broad shoulders to completely block the microscopic drafts from the door, a subconscious act of absolute, unwavering protection that made Evelyn's hollow chest physically ache. He had provided so much unearned, gentle kindness, and she was entirely convinced she was about to repay him with the horrifying reality of her ruined body. She reached the wash basin. The lightweight, newly polished copper kettle Gideon had provided that morning still rested near the edge of the stove. It miraculously still held a perfect, comforting heat radiating softly against her freezing palms. She poured a meager amount of the lukewarm water into the basin, the faint trickle sounding violently loud in the profound, heavy silence of the cabin. With trembling, pale hands, Evelyn reached up to her throat. Her stiff, raw fingers fumbled clumsily with the tiny clasps of her frayed high collar. One by one, they gave way. The thick, suffocating fabric of the slate-blue dress finally fell open. She slipped the heavy garment off her fragile shoulders, pushing the worn wool down to her waist, leaving her upper body completely exposed to the chilling air of the cabin. The pale, silver light of the mountain moon sliced flawlessly through a narrow gap in the heavy oak shutters, falling directly across her bare back. The scars were a horrific, breathtaking testament to survival. They began at the base of her delicate neck, sweeping violently across her entire low-epte shoulder blade and trailing jaggedly down her slender spine. It was a massive, angry landscape of thick, puckered ridges and melted, uneven flesh. The skin was entirely ruined, pulled agonizingly taut and desperately fragile. A permanent, highly visible echo of the absolute inferno that had consumed her home, her husband, and her previous life. In Oakhaven, the townspeople had viciously whispered about the monster beneath the dress. The cruel women at the mercantile had averted their eyes in disgust, pretending she carried a contagion. She had slowly learned to internalize their profound revulsion, accepting that her body was a grotesque, defective tragedy meant to be permanently hidden from the light. She dipped a small, incredibly soft cloth into the warm water, her large hazel eyes filling with silent, bitter tears, as she pressed the damp, soothing warmth against the agonizingly tight ridges of her shoulder. A microscopic sigh of pure, unadulterated physical relief slipped past her lips. It was the faintest, softest sound, but to a man who had spent his entire adult life hunting the high, unforgiving ridges, deeply attuned to the snapping of twigs and the subtle shifting of the alpine wind, it was enough. Gideon's storm-gray eyes opened in the darkness. He did not move. He did not immediately sit up. He merely shifted his heavy gaze toward the wash station, expecting to see the fragile widow fetching a cup of water to soothe a dry throat. Instead, his breath completely stopped in his massive chest. The pristine moonlight illuminated her perfectly. Gideon stared at the fragile, impossibly slender curve of her spine, and the horrific, violent devastation marring her delicate skin. The sheer severity of the burns was paralyzing. In a single, crushing second, every confusing, fragmented mystery about the ruined widow violently locked into place. The charred, warped brass locket bearing the deeply morbid inscription, the desperate shrieking night terror, begging the shadows to let it burn. The violent, terrified flinch when he had gently touched her upper back by the wagon. The way she religiously guarded that suffocating high collar as if her very life depended on it. Gideon felt the heat drain entirely from his face. The letter from the town council had cruelly mocked her ruined state, but he had naively assumed they meant her destitute finances and her sickly, terribly underweight frame. He had absolutely no idea she was hiding a physical tragedy of this catastrophic magnitude beneath that frayed wool. His massive hands slowly curled into impossibly tight fists against his heavy canvas bedroll. She wasn't weak. She wasn't a fragile, broken bird. The sheer unfathomable pain she must endure every single time she moved her arm, lifted a bucket, or merely wore that heavy, abrasive dress was staggering. She had hauled water, swept the thick floorboards, and fought to lift his monstrous iron kettle, while battling the agonizing friction of ruined flesh tearing against stiff fabric. The profound realization of her quiet, titanic perseverance hit him with the brutal force of an avalanche. And then, a darker, far more devastating realization struck him. He remembered how he had burned the letter earlier that evening. He remembered his dark, brooding silence, entirely consumed by his fierce, protective fury toward the valley men. But he hadn't spoken a single word to her. He hadn't explained his anger. Gideon stared at her trembling, scarred shoulders in the moonlight. She was standing by the basin, gripping her battered valise, silently cleaning her weeping wounds. She was preparing to leave. She firmly believed his anger was directed entirely at her. She believed he had read the town's cruel description of her scars and recoiled in absolute, unforgiving disgust. She was braving the lethal, sub-zero night because she believed he found her monstrous. The absolute tragedy of her assumption completely shattered the mountain man's stoic, ironclad restraint. The thick canvas of his bedroll rustled sharply as Gideon slowly pushed his massive frame into a sitting position. He was a terrifyingly large man, and the thick timber floorboards gave a heavy, undeniable creak beneath his immense weight. Evelyn completely froze. The damp cloth slipped softly from her trembling fingers, landing in the copper basin with a quiet, damning splash. Every single muscle in her slender body locked in absolute, unadulterated terror. She did not breathe. She did not dare pull the heavy wool of her dress up. It was entirely too late. He had seen. The nightmare was finally realized. The armor was completely stripped away, and the ruined, hideous joke of Oakhaven was fully exposed in the merciless moonlight. She slowly, agonizingly turned her head over her right shoulder. Gideon stood up. He loomed heavily in the deep shadows of the cabin. A towering, exceptionally broad-shouldered giant entirely draped in darkness. His storm-gray eyes were locked directly onto the horrifying expanse of puckered, melted skin. Evelyn squeezed her hazel eyes violently shut, hot tears finally breaking free and tracking down her pale, terrified cheeks. She braced her incredibly fragile hands against the washstand, physically preparing herself for the harsh, disgusted reprimand. She waited for the cruel words. She waited for him to furiously demand she pack her bags and leave his sanctuary forever. She waited to be discarded. The heavy, incredibly rhythmic thud of his massive boots echoed against the timber floorboards. But the footsteps did not retreat toward the door to open it for her. They did not move away in revulsion. Instead, Gideon stepped completely out of the shadows, moving deliberately, heavily, further into the room. He walked directly toward the terrible, ruined truth she had tried so desperately to hide. Evelyn's breath hitched completely in her throat, her knuckles turning bone white against the wood. How would she possibly survive the look in his eyes when he finally reached her? Gideon stopped mere inches behind her. Evelyn was paralyzed, her heart drumming a frantic, terrified rhythm against her ribs. She was fully exposed to the crisp, freezing air of the cabin, the icy draft playing over the jagged, sensitive ridges of her burns. She was waiting for the revulsion, for the sharp intake of breath, for the giant to recoil in horror. Instead, she felt the warm, radiating heat of his massive body blooming behind her. Gideon did not speak. He did not ask her to cover herself. He did not pull away. With a level of deliberate, agonizing care that defied the sheer scale of his massive, calloused hands, he reached out. His fingers hovered for a fleeting, trembling second, as if he were afraid even his presence might bruise her. Then, he touched her. He did not touch the scarred tissue itself. He rested his large, incredibly gentle hands on the unburned skin of her waist, anchoring her, grounding her. His touch was firm, steady, and entirely free of the pity she had dreaded. It was a silent, powerful claim of presence. Evelyn gasped. A broken, involuntary sound, her shoulders hitching upward as she prepared for the inevitable rejection. Gideon leaned forward, his heavy, weathered face settling near the curve of her neck. He did not look away. He looked at the scars. He studied them with a quiet, solemn focus that spoke of an ancient, deep-seated reverence. The men in the valley, Gideon rumbled, his deep voice a low, gravelly vibration that resonated through her very marrow. They sent you here as a joke, because they are small, frightened, pathetic creatures who cannot stand the sight of true courage. Evelyn's hazel eyes snapped open, wide with shock, as she stared into the wash basin. His voice was not disgusted. It was thick, with a dark, simmering, protective rage not at her, but for her. Gideon shifted, his massive hand moving with impossibly light grace to retrieve the soft cloth from the basin. He wrung it out, the water dripping softly onto the floorboards. They saw this, he murmured, nodding toward the jagged landscape of her back. And they saw something they could never possess. They saw a strength that would have incinerated them. He began to wash the delicate, sensitive skin around the burns, his motions so incredibly precise So gentle that Evelyn felt her terrified heart finally begin to slow. He was not looking at her vacep hat revulsion. He was looking at her as if she were made of the most precious, fragile porcelain. "Moat, I'm not a monster," she whispered, the words barely audible. A fragment of the truth she had been terrified to speak aloud. "No," Gideon replied, his tone shifting into something hauntingly solemn. "You are the only person who has ever truly survived the fire. You are the fire, Evelyn. And you are here." He reached for a jar of thick, soothing, pine resin salve he kept on the shelf. A potent traditional remedy for deep tissue healing he had harvested himself from the ancient timber stands. He scooped a generous amount onto his thick calloused palm, warming it between his fingers until the substance became pliable and fragrant, with the sharp, clean scent of the high forest. He applied the salve to her back. His large, scarred hands were incredibly deft, moving with a rhythm that was almost hypnotic. He worked the ointment into the tight, puckered ridges of the burns, his touch firm enough to increase blood flow, but gentle enough to soothe the chronic, agonizing tension held in her muscles. Evelyn let out a long, ragged exhale, her hands finally relaxing their white-knuckled grip on the wash basin. The cooling, healing sensation of the resin cut through the searing ache she had lived with for months. She leaned back, a motion she never would have dared with anyone else, her spine instinctively curving toward his heat. The silence between them was no longer a void, it was an altar. In this moment, Cypher, the joke of the valley, was completely dissolved. The man who had been sent a bride he didn't ask for was, for the first time in his life, fully present, completely focused, and deeply, viscerally connected to the fragile woman in his arms. When the fire took everything, Gideon whispered into the quiet, his voice uncharacteristically vulnerable. Mott thought Mott was the only one left in the world who understood that silence is just another word for survival. He finished the application, his hands lingering on her shoulders, his thumbs tracing the lines of the scars with a slow, contemplative reverence. It was the most intimate act of her life. He was not just healing her skin. He was witnessing her pain, acknowledging it, and refusing to turn away from it. Evelyn felt a strange, terrifying warmth bloom in the center of her chest, a feeling she hadn't dared to entertain since the ash had settled over her old life. She was no longer just a widow. She was no longer just the joke of Oakhaven. She was seen. She slowly turned, pulling her dress up to cover her skin, though she did not look away from him. Her hazel eyes searched his storm-gray gaze, finding only a steady, unwavering commitment. "Why are you so kind to me, Gideon?" she asked, her voice trembling but clear. He didn't pull away. He stepped closer, his massive frame towering over her, yet he made himself small, making himself accessible. "Because," he rumbled, his voice thick with an emotion he had spent years trying to bury. Moat spent too long looking at the mountain, and forgetting that the only thing that makes it worth living in is another soul. Evelyn reached out, her hand hovering near his rugged, bearded jaw. He dimmed T flinch. He leaned into her touch. A simple, powerful movement of surrender that caught her completely off guard. Her fingers touched the rough stubble of his beard, her palm resting against the solid, grounding heat of his face. She felt the heavy, thudding pulse of his throat beneath her skin. He was real. This moment was real. The profound, fragile peace of the cabin was suddenly, violently interrupted. A deep, low-frequency tremor shook the floorboards beneath their feet. It was the wind. It was the rattling of the shutters. It was a massive, subterranean groan that seemed to rise from the very roots of the mountain. The heavy iron lantern hanging from the ceiling beam swung wildly, clattering against the timber. Gideon's head snapped toward the wall, his eyes narrowing instantly. "The ridge," he muttered. his voice shifting from soft intimacy to lethal. Focused clarity. Another, duh. Louder rumble shook the cabin. A fine mist of dust and aged debris sifted down from the rafters. The sound was distinct, a heavy, grinding, sliding noise that was gaining velocity at an alarming rate. "Gideon?" Evelyn whispered, her fear returning in a sharp, sudden spike. "A timber slide," he commanded, his movements blurring as he lunged for his heavy duster coat. The weight of the snow on the upper slope. The warming trend tonight has destabilized the shelf. He didn't pause. He grabbed her by the hand, his grip solid and unbreakable. "The slide is coming straight for the canyon pass," he explained, dragging her toward the heavy oak door. "If it hits the cabin directly, we won't survive the structural collapse. We have to reach the secondary storm cave in the rock wall." "Move." He threw the heavy iron bar. The wind that rushed in was not a breeze. It was the roar of an approaching locomotive. The entire world outside the cabin was shifting. Huge, ancient pine trees were snapping like dry kindling as the wall of snow and timber began its descent. Gideon shoved her through the doorway, his arm wrapping around her waist to shield her as they plunged into the blinding, swirling chaos of the mountainside. The earth beneath them lurched, a violent and sickening tilt that threw them off balance. "Run!" Gideon shouted, his voice barely audible over the deafening, earth-shaking roar. Just as they reached the edge of the clearing, a massive ancient hemlock tree to their left groaned and began to tip. Gideon saw it instantly. He didn't think. He didn't hesitate. He launched himself at Evelyn, his massive body serving as a human shield as he tackled her toward the safety of the rock overhang. The hemlock crashed down, followed immediately by a suffocating, crushing weight of snow and splintered timber. Gideon let out a choked, guttural sound of intense, searing pain as a heavy beam pinned his shoulder, the massive weight of the slide burying them both in a tomb of white. Evelyn screamed, her hands scrabbling uselessly against the suffocating, freezing mountain of debris. She was free of the wood, but Gideon lay silent, pinned beneath the weight of the forest, his face pressed into the snow, his eyes closed. "Gideon!" she shrieked, her voice cracking, her hands clawing at the frozen ground. He didn't move. He didn't breathe. She was trapped in the middle of a nightmare, and the only man who had ever looked at her scars and seen a person was dying in the dark. The silence that followed the roar was the loudest thing Evelyn had ever heard. It was a heavy, suffocating pressure that pressed against her eardrums, broken only by the ragged, terrified sound of her own breathing. The mountainside had been transformed. The pristine clearing was a chaotic graveyard of splintered pine, churning snow, and shattered earth. The cabin was obscured, half buried under a massive, sliding tongue of debris. Evelyn scrambled to her knees, her hands plunging into the freezing, churned snow. She found him. Gideon lay sprawled in the white, his massive frame unnaturally still. A thick, jagged beam of ancient hemlock lay across his shoulder, pinning him firmly to the earth. A smear of dark, shocking crimson stained the snow near his temple. "Gideon!" Her voice tore through the frigid air, thin and desperate. She clawed at the snow, her fingers numb, burning with the cold. She grabbed his arm, shaking him. He was a mountain of a man, solid and unyielding. But beneath her touch, he felt terrifyingly distant. "Gideon, wake up. Please." There was no groan, no shifting of his heavy frame. Nothing but the terrible, rhythmic hiss of the wind through the remaining trees. The panic that initially paralyzed her began to recede, replaced by a cold, hard clarity that she had never known. She was the one who had been broken, the one who had been discarded, the one who had spent months believing she was the fragile, ruined thing. But as she stared at the giant who had sacrificed his body to shield her from the crushing weight of the forest, the lie of her own fragility shattered. She stood up. The snow crunched beneath her boots. She looked at the hemlock beam. It was massive, far beyond her ability to lift. She could not move the tree. She could not force the mountain to release him. But she did not need to lift the entire tree. She only needed leverage. She scanned the debris. A broken branch, thick and sturdy, lay trapped in the snow just a few feet away. She lunged for it, her movements precise and driven by a primal, desperate focus. She jammed the branch beneath the beam, using a jagged rock as a fulcrum. She threw her entire weight against the branch. The wood groaned. It didn't move. She screamed. Not in terror, but in a raw, guttural burst of pure effort. She pressed her scarred shoulder against the beam, the old wounds beneath her dress tearing and protesting, radiating white-hot agony that surged up her neck and down her spine. She ignored it. She didn't fight the pain. She used it. She channeled every memory of the fire, every drop of the humiliation she had suffered in Oakhaven, every ounce of the silent strength she had been forced to cultivate just to exist. She shoved. The beam shifted. A mere inch. But it was enough. A sharp, pained gasp tore from Gideon's lips. His eyes fluttered, dark and unfocused, as the pressure on his shoulder eased just enough for him to pull his arm free. He didn't wake, but the air hissed through his teeth, a sound of agonizing, conscious life. Evelyn didn't stop. She grabbed him by his heavy coat, her muscles burning, her own heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She hauled him in by inch, dragging him through the slush and shattered timber toward the rocky overhang of the secondary storm cave. It was a distance of 20 yards. It felt like miles. She fell. She scrambled. She pulled, saw. She ignored the way her skin protested, the way the cold bit into her, the way the world seemed to tilt and spin. She was the mountain, now. She was the shelter. She reached the cave's mouth, a shallow, sheltered depression in the rock wall. She dragged him into the dim, icy safety, collapsing beside him. The wind howled outside, hungry and wild. But here, the rock formed a wall against the devastation. Evelyn huddled over him, her hands trembling as she checked him. His breathing was ragged, shallow, and wet. The wound on his temple was bleeding sluggishly, matting his thick, dark blonde beard with frozen gore. His shoulder was clearly crushed, the angle of it sickeningly wrong. "Gideon," she whispered, her hands cupping his face. His skin was deathly cold. "You have to wake up. You cannot leave me here." He didn't answer. He slumped against the stone, a limp, hulking mass of raw, beautiful power. She tore off her own shawl, pressing it firmly against the wound on his head. She worked with a frantic, systematic efficiency, stripping away the heavy outer layers of his clothing to keep him from going into shock, wrapping him in the remains of his own duster and her thin, ruined dress. She realized with a jolt of clarity that she was shaking, but not from the cold. She was looking at the man who had seen her scars and called her fire. The man who had built her a sanctuary. The man who had chosen to be crushed by a forest rather than let her be touched by the slide. She touched his face, her thumb tracing the line of his jaw. The stubble was rough, Familiar. You fool, she breathed, a choked sob catching in her throat. Why did you do it? She knew why. He need to answer. He had looked at her, not as a victim, but as a person, and he had decided her life was worth more than his own. The realization washed over her with the force of a tidal wave. She had spent her life feeling like a burden, a broken thing that needed to be hidden. But as she knelt there, in the freezing dark, nursing the giant back from the edge of the void, she felt an immense, terrifying sense of purpose. She was not a burden. She was his home. She pulled him closer, tucking his heavy, limp head onto her lap. She brushed the snow from his hair, her fingers lingering on the places where he was broken. She didn't feel disgusted. She didn't feel horror. She felt a profound, aching tenderness that terrified her. If he died, she would be alone in a way she had never been before. She would not just be alone in the world. She would be hollowed out. She leaned her forehead against his, closing her eyes. She hummed a low, tuneless melody, something her mother had hummed when she was a child, a song of comfort and safety that she had forgotten until this very moment. Moat am here, she whispered to the darkness, to the mountain, to the man who lay silent beneath her touch. Mort am here. Hours bled into the freezing night. The storm raged. But, within the cave, the silence was absolute. Evelyn didn't sleep. She watched his chest. She counted his breaths. She kept the pressure on his wound, her fingers aching, her body stiff with cold. But she didn't move. Toward the deepest part of the night, when the frost seemed to settle into the very marrow of the rocks, Gideon's hand twitched. His fingers curled, gripping a handful of her skirt. Evelyn held her breath. Evelyn? The voice was a rasp. A broken, barely audible sound that seemed to pull him back from a great distance. She leaned over him, her eyes searching the gloom. His eyelids fluttered, struggling against the darkness. The storm-gray eyes finally locking onto hers with a look of dazed, profound confusion. Where? He rasped, his eyes darting to the cave walls. We are safe, she breathed, tears finally spilling over, hot and stinging. You are safe. Moat, have you? Gideon stared at her. Even in the dim light, she could see the way his gaze moved over her face. Checking. Searching. He was hurt. His body broken. His strength drained. But his eyes were alive. You moved, he muttered, his voice barely a breath. The beam. You. How? Evelyn smiled. A fragile, trembling thing that reached her eyes for the first time in years. Moat told you, she whispered, her hand moving to his chest, feeling the steady, thudding beat of his heart. Moat and the fire. He didn't speak. He could He looked at her. And for a fleeting, powerful second, Dustin, the stoic mask of the mountain man slipped. He didn't see a widow. He didn't see a joke. He saw the woman who had pulled him out of the dark. His hand, heavy and trembling, reached up, his calloused fingertips ghosting over the high collar of her dress, then moving upward to tuck a loose strand of hair behind her ear. It was a movement of hat exquisite, raw vulnerability that it made her heart ache. You, he breathed, then winced as pain clearly spiked through his shoulder. Do not talk, she commanded softly, her voice gaining a strength she didn't know she possessed. Rest. We will wait for the dawn. We will wait for the mountain to be quiet. He nodded, his eyes closing, his hand dropping to rest against her waist. He trusted her. She sat there, trapped in the freezing cave, cradling the giant who had saved her, realizing with a terrifying, beautiful clarity that she was no longer just surviving. She was living. But as the night wore on, a new fear began to gnaw at her. Gideon was breathing. Yes. But his color remained pale, and the cold was seeping into the cave with a relentless, predatory hunger. The fever had not set in yet, but she knew it was coming, and she knew that the worst of the injury was not what she could see on the surface. What if the beam had done more than crush his shoulder? What if the mountain had broken him in ways she couldn't fix with salves and prayers? She looked at him, his face slack in the dim light, the rugged, weathered features etched with pain. She was the one who had pulled him out, but could she keep him here? The open loop of his survival hung in the freezing air, a question she was terrified to answer. The dawn did not bring light to the cave. It only brought a deeper, more pervasive grayness that seeped into the stone like the chill itself. The mountain remained silent, held in the frozen grip of the timber slide, burying the world beneath a heavy, suffocating mantle of white. Evelyn did not move. She remained huddled on the rock floor, her legs stiff and cramping, her lap serving as a pillow for the man who had, until yesterday, been the only source of strength she had known. Gideon's fever had arrived with the first gray hint of morning. It was a rapid, aggressive heat that seemed to radiate from his very core, clashing violently against the unnatural, clammy cold of his skin. His massive frame, usually so solid and composed, was now given to fitful shudders. His jaw was clenched, his breath coming in shallow, ragged bursts that rattled against the quiet of their limestone tomb. She had used the last of the dry, salvaged moss from the cave's floor to pack the wound on his shoulder, binding it with strips of her own petticoat. It was meager, insufficient, but it was all she had. She had to keep the inflammation at bay. She had to keep him here. Evelyn dipped a scrap of cloth into the last of their melted snow, carefully dabbing the sweat from his forehead. Her hands were raw, her fingernails broken, and packed with dirt from the digging. But she worked vacate steady, clinical grace. The irony of the situation did not escape her. In Oakhaven, she had been the one looked after, or rather, the one whose brokenness was a spectacle. She had been the fragile widow, the woman who needed to be handled with care, the burden to be managed. Here, in the belly of the mountain, she was the anchor. She was the one holding the line between life and the abyss. The giant shifted, a groan tearing from his throat. His eyes, usually sharp and grounded, were glazed, unfocused. The delirium was taking hold. The timber, he muttered, his voice a gravelly, broken sound. Too heavy. What couldn't he reach them? Evelyn gripped his hand, her thumb stroking the rough, scarred skin of his knuckles. You are not there. Gideon. You are here. With me. You are safe. He didn't hear her. He was drifting in the currents of a dark, submerged memory. His hand tightened around hers, a crushing, possessive grip that betrayed his fear. Frozen, he whispered, his eyes darting beneath heavy lids. The ice. It was so fast. She just looked at me. And then she was gone. Evelyn felt a cold spike of dread in her chest, sharp and biting. She knew with a sudden, intuitive certainty that he was talking about the slide. He was talking about a past she knew nothing about. The stoic, solitary timberman who had built this cabin to be a fortress against the world was not just running from the cold. He was running from a ghost. She leaned down, pressing her cheek against his temple, ignoring the feverish heat. She needed to ground him. She needed to pull him back to the present, away from whatever tragedy had carved such a profound, lonely silence into his soul. Gideon, look at me, she breathed, her voice firm, commanding. You are not failing. You are breathing. Moat am right here. You saved me. That was a failure. His breathing hitched. The grip on her hand slackened just a fraction, then tightened again. Moat tried, he murmured, his voice cracking, shedding the armor of his stoic mountain man persona. Moat reached out. Moat was a man of the valley then. Moat had hands that worked. Moat had strength. But it was enough. It was never enough. Evelyn watched him, her heart aching with a profound, aching tenderness. He had lived his life believing that his strength, the very thing he defined himself by, was a lie because it hadn't saved someone he loved. He had retreated to the high country not just for solitude, but for penance. He had isolated himself because he believed he was a man who failed the only duty that mattered: protection. She felt a surge of fierce, protective rage against the man he used to be. The man who had burdened himself with such an impossible, crushing weight of guilt. You are not the same man, she whispered into his ear. Her voice, a low, steady chant designed to weave through the fever. The mountain hasn't changed you, Gideon. It has only revealed you. You are the man who pulled me from the rubble. You are the man who shared his fire. You are not a failure. He went still. His breathing leveled out, though the heat remained. A burning, flickering candle in the dark. For hours the cave was their entire world. The wind outside eventually died down, replaced by a heavy, oppressive stillness. Evelyn didn't move. She didn't let him go. She watched the way the fever carved lines of pain into his rugged face, and she realized that she was no longer afraid of the future. She had found a purpose in his survival that eclipsed her own fear. She had found a strength in the reversal of their roles that she hadn't known she possessed. She had been the broken widow, but now she was the healer. By late afternoon, the light in the cave shifted, deepening into a bruised, indigo twilight. Gideon's fever began to break, the sweat cooling on his skin, the frantic shivering subsiding into a deep, exhausted sleep. Evelyn finally allowed herself to lean back against the rock wall, her body trembling with the aftereffects of the adrenaline. She was ravenous, her throat parched, and every inch of her body protested the cold. But she remained watchful. She looked at him, his head resting heavily on her lap. The rugged, weathered face was finally peaceful, the lines of tension around his eyes softening in his sleep. He looked younger, now almost boyish, without the weight of his stoic mask. She brushed a lock of dark blonde hair back from his forehead, her touch lingering on the rough stubble of his beard. She had come here as a joke. She had come here as the ruined, damaged goods of a town that despised her. She had come here expecting to be discarded. Instead, she had found the one person who looked at Moat through her scars and saw a survivor. She had found the one person who required her presence as much as she required his protection. The shift was complete. The wall between them, the wall of his self-imposed isolation and her self-imposed shame, had been breached. But the shadow of his past lingered. He had spoken of a girl, of ice, of failing to reach someone. It was the core, the root of his solitary life, a secret he had guarded with as much intensity as he guarded his own heart. Evelyn watched his chest rise and fall, the rhythmic dan steady pace of a man tethered to the earth by her. She had saved his life. But could she save him from his own memories? As the night began to deepen, a sudden, sharp sound echoed from the cave entrance, the crunch of heavy boots on packed snow. Evelyn froze, her hand flying to Gideon's chest. The sound was distinct. It wasn't T, the wind. It was T, a falling rock. It was a footstep. Someone was climbing up the slide debris. Someone was looking for them. She looked at the cave opening, then down at the unconscious, feverish giant in her arms. Who would come to this forgotten, lethal height in the middle of a blizzard? And more importantly, were they coming to help, or to finish what the Oakhaven Council had started? The crunching of boots against the frozen debris outside the cave entrance was rhythmic, deliberate, and terrifying. Evelyn did not hesitate. Her transition from the terrified, fragile widow to a creature of fierce, singular purpose was so seamless. She didn't even recognize the change in herself. She gently eased Gideon's heavy head from her lap, sliding a folded portion of her own shawl beneath it to cushion his unconscious form. She stood, her body aching from hours of immobility, her joints popping in the quiet. She reached down, her fingers closing around a jagged, heavy piece of limestone that had broken off the cave wall during the slide. It was cold, rough, and solid, a weapon of last resort. She moved to the mouth of the cave, pressing her back against the jagged rock face, her heart hammering not with the frantic rhythm of a victim, but with the focused, icy clarity of a guardian. A silhouette blocked the gray light of the storm-muted day. A man, wrapped in thick, snow-caked furs, paused at the threshold. He carried a heavy rifle slung across his back, his face hidden behind a thick, frosted beard and a pulled-down hat. He peered into the dimness of the cave. "Gideon?" the man called out, his voice a raspy, weathered baritone that carried the weight of many hard winters. Mort saw the slide from the ridge. "You in there?" "Man." Evelyn didn't lower the stone. She didn't speak. She waited, her hazel eyes scanning for any sign of aggression. The man took another step, then stopped, his nose twitching as he caught the scent of the cave, the sharp, medicinal tang of pine resin, and the unmistakable iron-heavy musk of blood. He removed his hat, revealing a shock of prematurely white hair and a face etched with the deep, topographical lines of a life spent battling the high peaks. He was a stranger. He was Silas, the old, solitary trapper who worked the furthest northern reaches of the timberline. "Evelyn," the man said, his voice dropping as he spotted her in the shadows. He didn't raise his hands, but he made himself smaller, less threatening. "It's Silas. Mot vi known Gideon since he first came to these mountains. Mot met not here to do you harm." Evelyn lowered the rock, though she did not drop it. Her chest heaved with the release of the adrenaline spike. "He's hurt," she whispered, her voice rasping from the cold. "Yes." He says, burning up. Silas moved past her with a practiced, fluid grace that belied his age. He knelt beside the unconscious giant, his hands ruer, gnarled versions of Gideon's, checking for a pulse, pressing a finger to the wound on the temple. "He took a heavy hit," Silas muttered, pulling a small, corked vial from his coat. "But he has got a constitution like a bull elk. He and weather it, if the cold doesn't claim him first." He looked at Evelyn, his eyes pale blue and piercing, surveying the scene. He saw the improvised bandages, the way she had sacrificed her own clothing to wrap the giant, and the unmistakable, protective stance she held even now. A look of profound, quiet respect crossed his weathered features. "You did this," Silas stated. not as a question, but as a realization. Evelyn nodded, tucking the stone behind her back. Mort had to. He's a man who has spent a long time refusing to let anyone in, Silas murmured, uncorking the vial and pressing it to Gideon's cracked lips. He believes that if he keeps his circle small, he can hurt anyone, and no one can hurt him. Gideon groaned, the bitter liquid forcing a reflex that made him cough. His eyelids flickered, then forced themselves open. They were glassy, wild with the tail end of the fever, but they settled as they found Evelyn. Silas, Gideon rasped, his voice sounding like grinding gravel. You stubborn fool, the old trapper chuckled, though his eyes remained serious. You damn near buried yourself in a timber slide. If this woman hadn't been here to drag you out, you'd be part of the mountain by now. Gideon's gaze shifted to Evelyn. He stared at her for a long, silent moment. He saw her disheveled hair, the dirt smudged across her cheek, the fierce, protective tension in her posture, and the way she held the jagged rock behind her back. The confusion in his eyes slowly gave way to a dawning, shattering realization. She had not run. She had not abandoned him to the freezing dark. She had stayed. Evelyn, he breathed, his hand moving weakly, palm up on the stone floor. She crossed the space between them in an instant, dropping to her knees and taking his hand. His skin was finally cooling, the unnatural heat of the fever abating. But he was physically depleted, broken in a way she hadn't seen him before. He was vulnerable. Mort met here, she whispered, her thumb tracing his palm. Mott met not going anywhere. Gideon looked up at Silas, his jaw tightening. The pass? Buried, Silas confirmed, his expression darkening. It'd be days before a team can clear it. Mottv got my camp a mile over the ridge, in the lee of the cliff. It ass warm, and Mort V got supplies. We move you there, or you 1T last the night. The damp in this cave is a killer. Gideon looked back at Evelyn. It was a silent conversation, a question of whether she could survive the journey, whether he could bring himself to rely on her, and whether he was ready to let his carefully constructed fortress be breached. She's done enough, Gideon muttered, his eyes dark. She needs to get to the valley. Devastating confusion crossed his features. He had sent her away. He had sacrificed everything to ensure she would never have to breathe the air of this town again. Evelyn, he rasped, his voice barely audible, a sound of agony and shock. Why? She didn't stop until she reached him. She moved past the frozen, gaping men, past Holloway, who stood paralyzed with his pistol hanging slack at his side. She reached the man who had been her sanctuary, and she reached out, placing her hands on the heavy, blood-stained canvas of his coat. You told me to run, she said, her voice steady, loud enough for the entire square to hear. But you forgot the most important part of the fire. Gideon. It does run from the darkness. It consumes it. She turned, and, her hazel eyes sweeping the square, she looked at the neighbors, the councilmen, the men who had spent their lives measuring their worth in coin and cruelty. She didn't look at them with fear. She looked at them with a pity so profound it stripped them of their power. The gold is yours, she announced, gesturing to the scattered coins in the mud. Keep it. Let it feed the emptiness you've built in this town. You have your prize. But you will never have us. Holloway, shaken by the sheer, unyielding presence of the woman who had been the town's punching bag, struggled to find his tongue. You were supposed to be gone. You were supposed to be lost. Mott was never lost, Evelyn replied, her voice cooling to ice. Mutt was just waiting for the right person to show me that Mutt was already home. She looked back at Gideon. He was watching her, and for the first time, the mask of the stoic, self-flagellating mountain man was gone. There was only a man, wounded and vulnerable, looking at a woman who had finally, truly, chosen him. She didn't wait for the town to react. She didn't care if they attacked. She simply reached up, unhooking her arm from his, and placed her hand firmly against the small of his back, guiding him. "Meant, we are going home." "Gideon," she murmured. He looked at her, his eyes shining with a raw, terrifying love. He didn't argue. He didn't try to push her away. He leaned into her, letting her shoulder take his weight, letting her strength become his own. They walked out of the square, past the men who were too stunned, too shamed, or too busy scrambling for gold to stop them. They walked past the stores and the church and the shadows of the past, until the town was nothing more than a dull, fading light behind them. The journey back up the mountain was slow, measured by the limits of Gideon's broken body and the relentless, creeping cold of the night. But this time, there was no fear. When they finally reached the sheltered sanctuary of the cave, the world felt transformed. The silence was not a void, but a promise. Evelyn set about the work of healing. She did not rush. She built a fire, using the last of the dry kindling, and she sat beside him as the flames began to dance. She stripped away the ruined coat, the blood-soaked linen, and the layers of grime that had collected on his skin. She worked with the quiet, practiced efficiency of a surgeon. She cleaned the wound, she applied the fresh salve, and she bound his shoulder with steady, sure hands. Gideon watched her. He didn't speak. He followed her every movement, his gaze tracing the lines of her face, the curve of her jaw, the way her hair fell over her shoulders in a soft, dark wave. When she was finished, she sat back on her heels, her hands resting in her lap. "You are going to heal," she said, her voice soft in the stillness. Gideon reached out, his hand trembling slightly, and brushed a stray lock of hair away from her temple. His touch was electric, a reminder of the raw, elemental connection they had forged in the dark. "You came back," he whispered, as if he still could believe it. "Mott gave you everything Mott had. Mott gave you a future. You gave me the gold," she corrected, smiling a small, sad smile. "But you didn't give me the future. Mott had to choose it myself." She moved closer, sitting beside him, her back against the rock wall. He shifted, his uninjured arm pulling her against his chest, his large body shielding her, warming her. "Gideon," she whispered, her voice hitching. He looked down at her, his eyes searching hers, looking for the doubt, the hesitation, the fear. He found none. "The scars," she said, her voice barely a breath. "You saw them. You know what lies beneath the dress. You know Mott am not the woman Mott was. Mott am not the woman you thought you were marrying." He didn't pull away. He didn't look down. He reached out, his hand finding the collar of her dress, the fabric she had guarded for so long. With a gentle, deliberate motion, he unfastened the first button. Then, the second. He didn't hesitate. He pulled the collar aside, exposing the jagged, puckered ridges of the burns. The firelight flickered, painting the scarred skin in warm, amber hues. Gideon leaned forward, He didn't look at the injury with pity. He didn't look at it with horror. He pressed his lips against the center of the largest scar. A long, lingering, sacred touch that felt like an absolution. The contact was not sexual. It was an acknowledgement. It was a reclaiming. It was a promise. He kissed the pain. He kissed the trauma. He kissed the broken pieces until they didn't feel broken anymore. "You are whole," he whispered against her skin. His breath, a warm, steady comfort. "You were always whole." Moat was the one who was fractured. Moat was the one who was missing the pieces. Evelyn felt the tears finally release, a slow, quiet river of relief. She turned, burying her face against his neck, her hands clutching his shoulders. The giant, the mountain man, the silent protector. He was weeping too. They were two broken things that had found the only glue that could hold them together. The night passed, and with it, the ghosts. The mountain did not forgive, but it did remember. In the spring, when the snow melted and the first green shoots pushed their way through the thawing earth, a small cabin on the high ridge stood as a testament to a different kind of survival. The timberline was harsh. The winters were long, and the life was hard. But the cabin was no longer a fortress. The shutters were open. The smoke from the chimney drifted lazily into the blue sky, and the silence was no longer a weapon. Gideon worked the timber. His shoulder healed but scarred, a permanent reminder of the slide. Evelyn worked the garden. The earth beneath her fingernails, a sign of her own quiet power. They were not the same people who had met on that frozen Denver road. They were scarred. They were weathered, knocked, and they were profoundly, irrevocably changed. The story of the skinny bride and the mountain giant became a campfire memory, whispered by the travelers who passed through the valley. They said the mountain man had been tamed, or that the widow had been saved. But those who had seen them, those who had glimpsed the way they moved through the world, knew the truth. He hadn't tamed her, and she hadn't saved him. They had simply walked through the fire, and, in the ashes, they had found the only thing that mattered. They had found each other. The lesson was not that the fire didn't burn. The lesson was that you could burn. You could be scarred. And you could be broken. And you could still be whole. You could still be worthy of the light. And as the sun set over the peaks, painting the world in gold and violet, the cabin sat quiet, secure in the knowledge that they were finally, truly, exactly where they belonged. They were not running anymore. They were home. And for the first time in their lives, the mountain was not a place of isolation. It was a witness to their beginning. The fire was gone. But the flame, the small, steady flame they had built together in the dark, would burn, bright and unyielding, for the rest of their days. This story is a work of fiction inspired by Western romance tropes. All characters, names, and scenarios are products of the author's imagination and are used fictitiously. Any resemblance to actual persons, living or dead, or actual events or locales, is entirely coincidental. This content is intended for entertainment purposes only, and promotes wholesome values, emotional resilience, and healthy relationships.